When I was 8, I secretly rode a vixen in the back mountain. But just as I was about to head back down the mountain feeling satisfied, suddenly a stunning woman appeared in front of me. She tossed me a red undergarment and then vanished instantly. I thought about coming back the next day to find her and see what she looked like. But who knew that very night I got possessed? In my days I had strange visions. I saw many toads and snakes trying to bite me. My grandfather noticed something was wrong immediately. He quickly invited the renowned Taoist Master Li to our home. As soon as Master Li arrived, he used a peach wood stick to prick my finger. When dark purple blood oozed out, my body felt much better instantly. Even the toads and snakes that were about to bite me disappeared without a trace. After I regained consciousness, Master Li quickly asked what I did that day. Having no choice, I told him everything. When he heard it, his expression immediately changed. And when he saw the red undergarment I pulled out of my pocket, he sighed heavily. My grandfather was terrified by his reaction. He anxiously asked what was going on. Master Li took a deep breath and said, "Today your grandson rode a fox spirit in the back mountain. The stunning woman he saw was the fox spirit in human form. What he did greatly offended her. The fox spirit left the undergarment to mark him and find him later. Although I pricked his finger to alleviate the issue, it won't last long." Hearing this, my grandfather was so scared he almost knelt down. "Master Li, you must help us. He's my only grandson. If something happens to him, how will I face his parents?" Master Li sighed and said, "Old young with our friendship, how could I not help? But the fox spirit has cultivated for 1,000 years. I'm no match for her. However, there's a way to try. But I don't know if you'd agree." "What is it? Tell me quickly," grandfather asked anxiously. "In our northeastern folklore there are 5 spirits: fox, yellow weasel, white snake, willow, and gray rat. Among them, fox spirits are the most reasonable and human-like. Today your grandson's actions are equivalent to tarnishing her honor. To resolve this grudge, the best way is to bring a bride price and formally propose to the fox spirit for your grandson. If she agrees, the matter can be settled." Hearing this, grandfather was stunned at first, then shook his head and said, "That's not possible. My grandson is still so young. Even if he were to marry, it should be to a human." But before he could finish, Master Li interrupted him. "If you want to save your grandson, this is the only way. Besides, many things in life are destined and unavoidable." Master Li's words left my grandfather speechless. Helplessly he turned to me for my opinion. He was worried I'd throw a tantrum and refuse to marry the fox spirit. But to his surprise, when I heard I could marry the beautiful woman with the perfect figure, I immediately stopped crying. I even nodded vigorously, urging him not to stop me. "I'm willing to marry her." Grandfather was stunned. He couldn't speak for a long time. Master Li, however, chuckled knowingly. "Old young, your grandson is quite something." Seeing that I agreed, the two of them went to the back mountain that very night to propose on my behalf. Grandfather brought along a black gold pendant necklace as a bride price. I'd heard him mention before that the pendant was made from dark wood and had been passed down for generations. It was originally meant for my future wife. Now he was actually giving it away. After grandfather and Master Li left, I lay on the bed alone and soon fell asleep. In my dream I found myself standing in a field of rapeseed flowers. In the distance, a mountain cliff and a waterfall were breathtakingly beautiful. Not far ahead of me, a woman in a white dress stood with her back to me, holding a pink oil paper umbrella. She looked just like a character from a drama. Although her face wasn't clear, I could tell she was the woman I had seen before. Curious, I tried to walk up to her, but no matter how I walked, I stayed in place. No matter how loudly I called, she didn't respond. The next morning, as soon as I opened my eyes, grandfather was smiling as he dressed me in a groom's outfit. He told me the proposal was successful. "We'll hold the wedding shortly." As he was helping me get dressed, I noticed his left hand was wrapped in bandages. Looking closer, I realized he was missing a pinky finger. I cried and asked him what had happened. He patted my head and smiled, saying it was nothing. "As long as you're safe, being able to marry a good wife, even losing an arm would be worth it." The wedding ceremony was simple. There were no guests invited. Master Li acted as the officiant and recited some words. I bowed 3 times to heaven and earth, then 3 times to my grandfather, and the ceremony was done. Before the bows, Master Li hung the gourd pendant, the bride price, around my neck. He told me to take good care of it, because the fox spirit now resided within it. She would always be by my side from now on. And so, I married at a young age. But even after the ceremony, she hadn't spoken a word, and I didn't know what she looked like. I only learned her name, Hu Muyan, from Master Li later. It was a beautiful name. Then Master Li pulled me aside and said, "I've long noticed your fate is extraordinary. Last night I discussed with your grandfather, and we decided that when you turn 18 you'll become my disciple. Would you agree?" At the time I didn't understand much. Hearing that I could become a Taoist's disciple, I eagerly nodded without hesitation. Seeing my agreement, Master Li was delighted. He even gave me 2 packets of spicy snacks. I was so happy my nose bubbled with snot. But happy times always pass quickly. In a blink 10 years flew by. At 18 I maintained stable grades in high school. consistently among the bottom 3. That summer, feeling utterly defeated after exams, I returned home in low spirits. After lunch, grandfather called me over and said, "You're 18 now. It's time to visit Master Lee and officially become his disciple." Hearing this, I froze. Honestly, back then I agreed to be his disciple, mostly because I was too young to understand. Now, as a young adult with a scientific education, how could I become a Taoist? So I casually gave an evasive reply, without giving grandfather a definite answer. By the afternoon, after taking a nap, it was already evening. Coincidentally, my childhood friend Lee Erden called and invited me to hang out. With nothing to do at home, I agreed. Erden and I walked aimlessly, chatting along the way. He was munching on sunflower seeds and asked me, "Shu Ji, you seem preoccupied today. Is it because you didn't do well on the finals?" I rolled my eyes at him. Have I ever done well on an exam? Then I told him what grandfather had said at noon. Erden and I had no secrets between us. He even knew about my fox spirit wife. But he had always kept it a secret and never told anyone else. To my surprise, after hearing my story, he was actually supportive of me becoming Master Lee's disciple. He said, "With your grades always at the bottom, even getting into a subpar university is unlikely. After graduating high school, you'll end up doing manual labor. Why not become a Taoist priest? Show off some tricks and you could easily make a few $100. What Erden said made sense, but I was still reluctant. In my opinion, even if I couldn't get into college, there were other options. For example, I could attend the prestigious Wangshan Technical School and learn to operate excavators. I could still marry a rich and beautiful woman and reach the pinnacle of life." While I was daydreaming, Erden suddenly stopped and whispered to me, "Shu Ji, did you hear splashing sounds?" I paused, then looked around. Faintly, I did hear splashing water, but then I realized we were near the village's west fish pond. I gave him a pat and laughed. "It's just the fish pond nearby. The fish must be pairing up. Don't overreact." But Erden shook his head and said, "The sound doesn't seem right. Let's go take a look." So the two of us immediately followed the path to the pond. As soon as we reached the pond, we were both startled. There was someone struggling in the water, crying out for help, though the dim light made it hard to see who it was. We could roughly tell it was a child. Erden gasped and shouted, "Oh no, someone's drowning. Quick, save them." Without even taking off his clothes, Erden jumped into the water. Without hesitation, I followed him in. Just as Erden was about to grab the child suddenly sank beneath the surface and disappeared. I swam frantically and shouted, "The kid's gone under. Quick, dive down and grab them." By then it was dark, and the water in the pond was murky. I couldn't see anything underwater. All I could do was feel around blindly with my hands. No matter how many times I dove down, I couldn't find anything. Panic began to set in. What if the child didn't make it? I took a deep breath and dove again. This time I was lucky. I felt the child's arm, but as I tried to drag them to the surface, I realized they were much heavier than I expected. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pull them up. Just as I was running out of strength, Erden arrived to help. He was stronger, and a better swimmer than me. With his help, we finally brought the child to the surface. Just as we were about to swim to shore with the child, my right leg was suddenly yanked downward. It felt like something was wrapped around it. Noticing something was wrong, Erden shouted, "Shuji, what's wrong?" I quickly replied, "It's nothing. Just a leg cramp. Get the child to shore first." I didn't dare tell the truth, fearing Erden might delay and put the child at greater risk. Every second mattered for the child's safety. Erden nodded and grunted, then continued swimming to shore with the child breathing heavily. As I prepared to check what was wrapped around my leg, the force pulling me suddenly increased, dragging me deeper underwater. I instinctively clamped my mouth shut, frantically flailing my limbs to try and surface. But strangely, no matter how hard I struggled, it was all in vain. I kept sinking deeper and deeper. As I exhausted my strength and was about to give up, the gourd pendant around my neck suddenly emitted. As soon as the white light appeared, I heard a shrill scream. The force wrapping around my right leg suddenly vanished. I couldn't figure out what had happened, but this was my best chance to escape. Without hesitation, I swam straight to the shallow water in one breath. By then 7 or 8 people had gathered on the shore, drawn by all the commotion. They were huddled around Erden and the rescued child. As soon as I got to shore, without even resting, I urgently asked Erden, "Erden, how's the kid?" Erden turned his head from the crowd, his voice trembling as he said, "The kid isn't breathing." I froze upon hearing this, and quickly pushed through the crowd. Sure enough, the child lay motionless on the ground. By the light of the rising moon, I saw the child's face. I recognized him. He was the son of Li Taidong from our village. As I carefully observed the boy's face, something felt off. His eyes were wide open, and the corners of his slightly open mouth seemed to form a faint curve. It almost looked like he was smiling. Before long, the boy's family arrived. Seeing them clutch his body and cry, everyone felt a deep sorrow. It was then that I learned the boy had gone out to play alone in the morning. By lunchtime he hadn't returned. His family had searched all afternoon but couldn't find him. Who would have thought he had drowned in the fish pond? After a period of weeping, Lee Taidong carried his son's body home. Though everyone was heartbroken, they had to prepare for the funeral. The villagers gradually dispersed, warning their own children not to go to the fish pond alone in the future. After Erden and I parted ways at the fish pond, I walked home with my mind in turmoil. For the first time I truly felt the fragility of life. Witnessing it disappear before my eyes, my emotions were a tangled mess. Grandfather walked home with me. Grandfather had also been at the scene when the incident happened. When we got home he sat on the kong. I leaned against the wall staring blankly at the newspaper-covered ceiling. Seeing this, grandfather asked, "Are you blaming yourself for not saving Xiaoli?" I nodded silently. If I had been faster, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But grandfather sighed and said, "Don't blame yourself. Even if you and Erden had acted faster it wouldn't have mattered. I examined Xiaoli's body just now, and to tell you the truth, that child had been dead for over 10 hours. Hearing this my scalp tingled. I asked in disbelief, "Grandpa, are you joking? How could Xiaoli have been dead for over 10 hours? That's impossible. Before Erden and I rescued him, we clearly saw him struggling in the water, crying for help." Grandfather shook his head and said, "I'm not lying. I looked very carefully just now. Xiaoli's body was already stiff and bloated, his skin pale and soaked. Someone who had just drowned wouldn't show these signs." As grandfather spoke I tried to recall the details, and indeed something felt off. When I grabbed Xiaoli in the water, his body was already stiff, and there was no sign of struggle. Normally someone who had just drowned would still show some movement. How could he have no response at all? Especially when I thought of Xiaoli's eerie expression. It sent chills down my spine. Noticing the change in my expression, grandfather asked, "Xiao Shu, tell me everything that happened during the rescue." Grandfather wasn't a mystic or Taoist priest, but having made coffins for over 50 years, he knew a thing or two about the unexplainable. So I recounted every detail without leaving anything out. After I finished, grandfather furrowed his brows and said, "Roll up your right pant leg and let me take a look." I hesitantly rolled up my pant leg, and what I saw froze me in place. On my calf there was a large bruise that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of bruise caused by something being tightly gripped. This must have been left when something wrapped around me in the fish pond. But what shocked me the most was the shape of the bruise. It was clearly a handprint. Seeing the distinct handprint, it became clear that what had grabbed me was not water plants but a hand. Considering that only Erden and the drowned Xiaoli were present, it was clear neither of them could have done it. So whose hand was it? My mind felt muddled, and a wave of inexplicable fear surged through me. It felt as if I had just brushed past death. Just then, a rapid knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. A middle-aged man's voice came from outside. "Uncle Yang, it's me, Lee Taidong, Xiaoli's father." Hearing this, grandfather opened the door. Standing outside was Lee Taidong, his eyes red and swollen. Behind him were 5 other men in their 30s or 40s. Grandfather asked, "What brings you here so late?" Lee Taidong, choking back sobs, replied, "I need to buy a coffin for my son. We plan to bury him tonight." Grandfather nodded, then grabbed a flashlight from the windowsill, and led them to the storeroom. Lee Taidong scanned the coffins, finally choosing a smaller pinewood one. After selecting the coffin, Lee Taidong said, "Uncle Yang, please help us with the arrangements. We're not sure what to do." Being a coffin maker, grandfather was well versed in funeral customs. Many villagers would turn to him for such matters. Grandfather nodded and agreed, bringing me along as we headed to Lee Taidong's home. Upon entering the courtyard, we saw about 20 or 30 people busy preparing. Xiaoli's body lay on a straw mat in the middle of the yard. Now dressed in new clothes, grandfather and I approached the body. We noticed that his previously rolled back eyes were now closed, and his face, apart from being pale and, aside from swelling and pallor, there was nothing unusual. After placing the coffin on the ground, Lee Taidong approached grandfather. He asked what the next step should be. Grandfather frowned and said gravely, "First put some dry straw and grains in the coffin. Then add 7 red dates and 7 copper coins." These items each had symbolic meaning. The straw and grains symbolized food, ensuring the spirit wouldn't go hungry on the road to the afterlife. The 7 red dates represented a wish for a swift reincarnation. The 7 copper coins were tolls for crossing the 7 gates of the underworld. Each gate required 1 coin for passage, making a total of 7 coins necessary. Once everything was properly placed, grandfather instructed Lee Taidong to lay Xiaoli in the coffin. He then asked a few men to nail the coffin shut. When everything was ready, grandfather took a deep breath and shouted, "Lift the coffin." As soon as he said this, Lee Taidong and the 5 other men braced themselves, preparing to lift the coffin. But a strange scene unfolded. The 6 men exerted all their strength, their faces turning red, yet the coffin didn't budge. I was familiar with the coffins grandfather made. This small pinewood coffin should have weighed about 200 pounds, even with Xiaoli and the burial items inside. It shouldn't exceed 300 pounds. Why couldn't they lift it? Li Taidong didn't think it was odd. He called over 2 more men to help lift the coffin. Even with their combined effort, nothing changed. The pinewood coffin seemed rooted to the ground, immovable. The atmosphere in the courtyard grew tense. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at the coffin in the center. Standing beside me, grandfather furrowed his brow. He walked over to Li Taidong and whispered, "I think something is off. Maybe it's best not to bury him tonight." Li Taidong hesitated but shook his head. "No, the child must be buried as soon as possible. No matter what, it has to be done tonight." He then called out to the others in the courtyard. "Neighbors, come help out. I promise I won't let your effort go unrewarded." Hearing this, grandfather sighed and said no more. After all, it was their family's matter. Grandfather could only offer advice and not interfere too much. Men called by Li Taidong exchanged glances, thought it over and eventually nodded in agreement. After all, they were from the same village. 8 more men stepped forward to help lift the coffin. Now there were 16 in total. For a small coffin like this, it should have been as easy as flipping over a small vehicle. Sure enough, the pinewood coffin swayed slightly, and finally it was slowly lifted. Even so, I noticed that everyone's faces were red and their legs trembled. They were clearly exerting all their strength. The fact that they managed to lift it should have been a relief. But they hadn't taken more than 10 steps when something unexpected happened. The rope connecting the coffin to the carrying poles suddenly snapped. The pinewood coffin crashed to the ground with a loud thud. The rope was as thick as a thumb, strong enough to hold a load weighing over 1,000 pounds. Yet it snapped inexplicably. Even the most oblivious person would sense something was wrong. For about 10 seconds there was complete silence. Finally Li Taidong broke the stillness and asked, "Uncle Yang, what's going on here?" Grandfather frowned, his expression serious. "This is unusual. I don't know what to do either. You should go and call Taoist Li. He'll definitely know what to do." Hearing this, Li Taidong seemed to realize something. He asked grandfather to oversee things, then rode off on a motorcycle. After the coffin fell, the atmosphere in the courtyard became tense. The villagers were silent, frowning and unwilling to speak. Some of the more timid ones slipped away to their homes. Sensing the unease, grandfather stepped forward and said, "Everyone, keep your distance from the coffin. Go back to what you were doing. Wait for Taoist Li to arrive." The courtyard gradually returned to its previous bustle. Although the villagers seemed a bit calmer, their fear was still evident on their faces. I quietly walked up to grandfather and asked in a low voice, "What's going on? Why does it feel like the coffin doesn't want to move?" Grandfather sighed and said, "It's not that the coffin doesn't want to move. It's that Xiao Li inside doesn't want to leave."